Hello, United States history students. Hey, what does it mean to be an American? What is the American mission? What are our values that we all hold in common? Well, when we think about these big ideas, these fundamental principles of the United States of America, most of us tend to turn to the founding document, the Declaration of Independence. And that's what this recorded lecture is about today. This is our foundational document, the Declaration of Independence. This is United States history at Upper Arlington High School. I'm your teacher, Mr. Endress. What is the Declaration of Independence? Well, this very important document really does two things. One, on July the 4th of 1776, we formally declared our independence from the Empire of Great Britain. We said essentially, we are our own country. And that's the first thing that it does. That's why we have a big celebration on July the 4th of every year. But the second thing that it does is it established the principles of our country. You can think of it sort of as a mission statement. Here's what the United States of America is going to be about. Here's what our values are. And the values that we set down in the Declaration of Independence were very different from most of the values of other countries at the time. For you see, most countries at the time had a monarchy. They had a king or a queen. There was a whole feudal hierarchy under that monarch, and everybody was expected to be obedient to their lord. The United States of America stated in the Declaration of Independence that we were going to be a country of free people. We were going to be a country without a king or a queen or any other type of monarch. And that made the Declaration of Independence a very radical document for its day and age. So the two things that the Declaration of Independence did on July the 4th, 1776, when it was signed, was it, one, declared independence from Great Britain, and two, established the principles upon which our country would be founded. Now, what I would like to do throughout most of this lecture is to discuss the historical context in which the Declaration of Independence was written, because this document just didn't come out of nowhere. It was a radical revolutionary document. But what I would like to reveal to you was how the Declaration of Independence was in fact a long time coming. And many of the ideas in this radical declaration had been in existence for nearly 100 years. So let's get into that historical context. So we're talking about the 1700s. That's the 18th century. That's over 200 years ago. And the 18th century was an era known as the Enlightenment. The term Enlightenment is not a modern term. People in the 18th century in Europe said, we are living during a time of enlightenment. They knew the culture was changing in the 18th century. So what was the era of the Enlightenment in the 18th century? What was it all about? Well, in the 18th century, people started developing a new culture of questioning tradition and authority. It was an exciting time. So let's take a moment to unpack this. What's that mean, to question tradition? So people started asking questions like, why are things the way they are? Why do we have to do things in a particular way? And many times the answer was because, well, this is the way it's always been done. That's tradition. To question authority, people would ask, well, why do we have to do things in a particular way? Well, it's because an authority, somebody with power, tells you you have to do that. And people in the 18th century felt empowered to challenge these things. Okay, so that's very general and abstract. Let's explain this in a more concrete way. So at the dawn of the 18th century, there were two practices that were commonplace that we can use as an example. One was the practice of torture, and the other was the practice of accusing somebody of being a witch. So torturing people and accusing people of witchcraft were very common at the dawn of the 18th century. But then what happened? Well, because of the culture of enlightenment, one particular individual, an Italian by the name of Cesare Beccaria, he questioned, does torture work? And he started investigating cases of torture, where somebody had been accused of something. This person was taken, captured, tortured until they elicited a confession. And in many times he discovered the person was innocent. They simply confessed to something because of the pain of torture. And in many cases, Beccaria believed that that form of torture was just inhumane. And so he wrote a book called On Crime and Punishments, in which he advocated for governments to cease the practice of torture. This book was read by a great many people in the 18th century, and the Empress of Russia banned torture because of this particular book. Just because governments had always tortured people, or some prosecuting force had always tortured people, doesn't make it right to continue the practice forevermore. And then there's witchcraft. Famously, in Salem, Massachusetts, in the year 1692, right before the 18th century, there was a famous case of witchcraft. This was known as the Salem witch trials. In the 18th century, people began questioning, like, well, what exactly is a witch? How does somebody get accused of witchcraft? What is witchcraft? Do witches actually exist? Or could these people who we identify as witches and who we execute for witchcraft just be people who don't fit in with the rest of society? And what we find is that, as the 18th century progresses, there are fewer and fewer cases of people being persecuted for witchcraft. So what's happening? People are questioning traditional practices. People are questioning people of authority who said we need to do these things. They're using logic and reason and sometimes science to identify how we can make society better. So that's the other thing that happens with the Enlightenment. There's a sense and a feeling of something called progress. That if we apply logic and reason to institutions to make those institutions better, then society as a whole and our lives will be better. And this made for a very exciting time, the 18th century. So another way of looking at it is like this. Before the Enlightenment, people respected tradition and authority. Tradition and authority. That person has authority, that person has power, therefore that person can do whatever it is they want to do, and we do not question it. Or even if we do question it, there's really nothing much we can do about it. And then tradition. Just because we've always done something one way doesn't mean we can't change things up for the present and the future. And that's what starts happening during the Enlightenment. Instead of respecting tradition and authority, people start respecting this: reason, logical thinking. We're only going to do things now because they make sense. This new culture of respecting reason seemed to help to create a better society. After all, a society where people aren't accused of witchcraft and aren't tortured seems to be a much better type of society than one where people are. There was a true excitement that things were getting better, and things were getting better because people were questioning everything. It was an exciting time. Throughout many countries in mostly Western Europe and in the American colonies, people would gather in homes and cafes where they would share books or the ideas contained in books. They would read journals, newspapers, where they would discuss the big ideas of the day, how things could continually be improved. In a day and age before the internet, television, or radio, ideas would be exchanged by letters across countries, around the world. And participants in these philosophical clubs considered themselves to be members of a republic of letters. So when Beccaria published his book on crime and punishment in Italy, that book was translated into a wide variety of different languages, and it spread across the world. In mostly Western Europe and in the American colonies, people would discuss the ideas of Beccaria. Is he right? Is he wrong? Could there be cases where torture is necessary? The 18th century was a very exciting time. It was a time of science, of logic, of reason, of an excitement around new ideas, and the idea that we can continually improve society. Now, where did the Enlightenment itself come from? What started the whole Enlightenment? I mean, why the 18th century? Why didn't it happen 1,000 years before? That's always a great question to ask when thinking about history. Why does something happen at a particular point in time and not at a different point in time? What makes the 18th century the right time for the Enlightenment? Well, in answering that question, I personally believe that there were two major events that sparked the Enlightenment, and these events happened at the end of the 17th century within 2 years of each other in one country. The country was England. Throughout this lecture, I will be talking about England and Britain. Those two words are interchangeable. I'm talking about the exact same place. And I say there were two events that happened there that sparked the Enlightenment. The first was the publication of a book. This is an image of a man named Isaac Newton. You have probably heard of Newton before, or at least I hope you've heard of Newton before. He was a mathematician and a scientist. Specifically, he was a physicist. And Newton published this book in the year 1687. This book has a long Latin title. I'm simply going to refer to this book as the Principia. The Principia may be the single greatest work of science ever published. What's contained in Principia? Well, a formula for gravity, also an explanation for how everything in the universe moves. These are a few of the big ideas contained in Principia. Okay, so formula for gravity and the formula for how things move. Great, so what? What does that do for us? How does this create this cultural shift into an enlightenment? Well, think of Newton's book like this. Prior to this book, nobody could really explain the movement of the planets, as well as the movement of things that happen here on Earth. So when you drop your pen, why it falls to the floor, and precisely at what rate does it fall to the floor. Nobody could explain these things, or at least not very precisely. Along comes Newton and gives us perfect mathematical formulas that can explain the movement of everything. It doesn't matter if you're in your bedroom here on Earth or in Mars. Things move in the exact same way. And then figuring that out is just the beginning, because what we can now do is predict the movement of things. So for example, Isaac Newton had a close personal friend whose name was Edmund Halley. And Edmund Halley was interested in many things, but he was interested in comets. Comets, which people looked at in the night sky as they saw a star with a tail on it. It only appeared randomly. And most people's interpretation of a comet in the 17th century was it was a portent of doom. God was angry at people, so he sent a comet to let him know that something bad was going to happen. And Edmund Halley took the ideas from his friend Newton's book, and he started making predictions. He didn't think that comets were the work of an angry god sent at random, but rather part of this mechanical universe that Newton had uncovered. So Edmund Halley predicted exactly when a comet would come again and exactly where in the night sky it would come again. He was able to make this prediction based upon, well, a collection of a whole bunch of research from comets in the past and Newton's book. And guess what? Halley did it. Now, sadly, the comet didn't show up until after Edmund Halley died, so Edmund Halley never got to see the comet that was named after that ended up being named after him. So sad. But look at what these two guys did, and especially Newton. They gave people a vision of the universe. This universe is not the product of a God who does random things, but rather there are mathematical laws that everything in the universe abides by. And we can figure out these laws through scientific observation, through logic, clear reasoning, mathematics. The publication of Newton's Principia in the year 1687 helped start the Enlightenment that would really take off in the following century, the 18th century. All right, so that's the first big event that helps to create the Enlightenment. The second was a political event, not a scientific one. It was an event called the Glorious Revolution, which began in 1688 and continued into 1689 and arguably into the following year of 1690. The Glorious Revolution is a complicated event to explain. I'll do my best to summarize it. From the year 1603 to the year 1688, England was ruled by horrible kings. Kings that really abused their power, were cruel to the people of England. This led to anarchy and chaos, and for a period of about a decade and a half, civil war. Times were bad. For a brief period of time, the English people killed their king and tried to rule without a king. They thought they would be completely free, and that things would be great. And sadly, things ended up worse than before. There was chaos. The economy was in ruins. That didn't work. But in 1688, after decades of struggling, the English people finally figured it out. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this greatly, but here's what happened. The English people chased their king out of the country. That king's name was James II. He had to run away to France. James II was a jerk. Not many people liked him. And so the English were free from their king. Hooray, hooray, hooray. But they also knew from prior experience that they still needed some sort of monarch. So here's what they did. They invited these two people to come and rule England. The individual on the right, her name is Mary. She was the daughter of James II. They liked her. Now, she hadn't been in the country in a while because she had gone to another country called the Netherlands to marry a popular and powerful landowner there. His name was William. So William and Mary, they were invited into the country to rule the country. The representatives of the English people said, "You are going to be our king and queen. William and Mary, you get to live in castles, you get to have endless servants, you will live a life of luxury. You will be a king and a queen. However, part of the deal is you will actually have very little political power. So you get to have all the fun of being king and queen, but you're not allowed to rule." Who rules instead? The people's representatives in an institution called Parliament. Parliament will rule England, not the king and queen. So as we think about William and Mary, don't you think if you were in their shoes, you'd take them up on this offer? Imagine if England contacted you and said, "Hey, we'd like for you to come and be king or queen of our country. You get to live in a castle, you have all these servants, you get to have all these fine meals, wonderful clothes, you get to be a celebrity, but you're simply not allowed to rule the government." Yeah, it sounds like a pretty good gig, doesn't it? And William and Mary thought so too, and they took the job. So now England has a very different form of government. It was called a constitutional monarchy, which means that they have a monarchy, but the monarchy is subject to a constitution. Now let's talk about what this constitution was and what it did for the culture. The year following the invitation to William and Mary and them coming to London to become the new king and queen of England, Parliament takes control of the country and Parliament begins passing laws to create a new country. And they established in the year 1689 the English Bill of Rights, which says this: people have rights. Rights are powers. So people have particular powers. And these powers are not allowed to be taken away from people except through due process in a court of law. So in other words, they break a law and they have to be punished, then somebody's rights can be taken away. But other than that, people have rights. Examples of these rights: people have the freedom of speech. People also have the freedom to bear arms in self-defense. People have freedom to not experience cruel and unusual punishment, like torture. People also have the right to something called habeas corpus. That's a fancy Latin term. What's that mean? It means that the police, when they come to arrest you, they must tell you what they are arresting you for, and you must receive a trial for violating that crime, or for violating that law, and for committing that crime. So in other words, the police can't just come and arrest you and throw you in jail and not tell you why they're doing it, and also you eventually get to have a trial. You can't just sit in jail for forever. It's an important right. People also have the freedom to petition the king. And then taxes. Who has the power to levy taxes? Who has the power to tax the people? Well, according to the English Bill of Rights, the only people who can levy taxes are those people who have been chosen by all of the people. Elected representatives, those are the people who can levy taxes. So no king can levy taxes. So with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, we've got a new king and queen on the throne of England. This king and queen, William and Mary, they had very little power. The power resided in the people's representatives in Parliament. Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which granted the people of England rights. And as you look over these rights, you should think, some of these sound familiar. Freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms and self-defense, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, habeas corpus. All that sounds sort of familiar, and it should. All this stuff makes a reappearance when we, Americans, form our government, but we don't form our government until nearly 100 years after the establishment of the English Bill of Rights. So as radical as our form of government was, the ideas for the founding principles of the United States of America goes back nearly 100 years. Now, the year after the English Bill of Rights was published, a particular writer, a philosopher in England, inspired by the English Bill of Rights, wanted to express why this new form of government was the best form of government. He wanted to articulate the ideas of democracy. And his name was John Locke. John Locke himself was very personally excited by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. He had actually been kicked out by England, by James II. He was on the run for his life. But when William and Mary were invited back over into England, and William and Mary rode on a boat across the English Channel into England to become the next king and queen, John Locke was on another boat coming across the English Channel with them. He was excited by this new form of government that the English were establishing. You know, it's not just that they were getting rid of James II, but they were creating this new structure of government where people were going to be free. And John Locke, who was a great writer and a great thinker, a great philosopher, he wanted to explain to the people, here's why this is the best form of government. So John Locke wrote a couple of essays that we call now 2 treatises on government. And in his essays, John Locke writes this. He says that the job of government is to protect the rights of the people. And this is a radically new idea. Previously, government had a feudal structure. So there was a king, a monarch at the top of this hierarchy. Beneath the king, beneath the monarch, were a series of lords, and barons, and earls, and other powerful landowners. And beneath those landowners were all the people that worked for the landowners. And so there was a hierarchy, there was a structure of authority. And if you were born into that feudal hierarchy, depending upon where you were in that hierarchy, you had to listen to whoever was more powerful than you. So, for example, let's say you were born just a common peasant in England prior to the Glorious Revolution. You didn't own your own land. You lived on a house that belonged on a land that belonged to a lord. And the lord said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I want you to grow grain. I want you to grow this much grain, and I'm going to collect this much grain from you, and anything else is yours. You don't really have a say in it. You're like, okay, this is what I've got to do. Lord tells me to do it. I've got to do it. There's no questioning this. And then the Lord says, hey, the King of England wants to go to war with the King of France. So guess what? You're now a soldier. You don't have a say in this. You got to saddle up and go. And that's how things worked. But Locke says, no, here's a new idea. All people are equal and they all have rights. All people are free. They can do what they want. And the job of government is not to bully people. It's not to tell people what to do, but rather a better government would be one where the people get together, elect representatives, and those representatives represent their people by creating laws and institutions that serve the people. So the government serves the people. the government also protects the rights of the people. And John Locke says this would create a better government, a better society. And in fact, this is what the English are doing, or rather had done during the Glorious Revolution and the establishment of the English Bill of Rights. So that's the big idea of John Locke. The job of government is to protect the rights of the people. The job of government is to serve the people. Now, he does articulate that people are born with 3 natural rights. John Locke simply believes that these rights are given to all people by God. These are rights that you are born with as a human being. He says that you have the right to life. You have a right to protect yourself. So in other words, if somebody comes and attacks you and they're trying to hurt you, you have a right to defend yourself. That's your first natural right. Your second natural right is the right to liberty. And I apologize, as I'm looking at this slide here, it looks like liberty is misspelled. It's missing a T there. I apologize for that. Liberty, which means you get to do whatever it is that you want to do, that you are capable of doing, provided you don't hurt anybody else in doing what you want to do. So there's nobody to stop you. If you want to go on to become a lawyer or a doctor or even a teacher, you can do these things. Or at least you have a right to attempt to try to do these things. See if you're good enough at it that people will pay you to do these things. You have your freedom. And you can do whatever it is that you want to do, provided you don't hurt anybody else in doing it. And then your last natural right that John Locke says that you have a right to property. You have a right to own things. So John Locke says you are born with the 3 natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and the job of the government is to protect those natural rights that you have. All right, so there's a lengthy explanation of the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, John Locke's philosophy. There was a lot there. And going back to this original question, what started the Enlightenment? Well, I say these 2 things. The publication of Newton's Principia and the Glorious, which happened in the year 1687, and the Glorious Revolution, which happened in 1688, which then led to the publication of the English Bill of Rights in the following year, 1689, and then John Locke published his 2 treatises of government in the year 1690. So all these things happened kind of right around the same time. It was a nice coincidence that Newton published the year before the Glorious Revolution and helped to create the Enlightenment of the following century. And hopefully you can see how these 2 events in history would create a culture of not trusting authority, of not trusting tradition, of thinking how science and logic and mathematics and reasonable thinking can help us to question the institutions and the practices that have always happened, to create better institutions and better practices that are more humane, that are more progressive, and can ultimately lead to a better society. And that was the culture of the Enlightenment. All right, let's take it to our home turf, North America. And in the 18th century, along the Atlantic seaboard of North America, there were 13 English colonies. Let's talk about these colonies for just a moment. Each of the 13 different colonies were established at different times by different people. Now, they were all under the governance of the King of England. So the King of England would have had to have granted a royal charter to make Georgia, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, all part of the British Empire. Once the royal charter was established, the king would appoint a governor of the colony. So the governor did not get his job by being elected by the people of the colony, but rather was appointed by the king. And the job of the governor was simply to enforce English laws there in the colony. And that's pretty much as far as the king could rule the colonies. It was a long distance between the American colonies and England, approximately a 2-month voyage by sea. So once the governor was appointed and the governor established, the governor simply makes sure English laws are obeyed. For the most part, the people in the 13 American colonies could do pretty much whatever it is they wanted to do, assuming that it was within the confines of the law. So there was a great deal of freedom in the American colonies. One thing worth noting is that by and large, the American colonists were not taxed by the British government. They were able to buy, make, and sell things without being taxed by the King of England. The other thing worth noting about the 13 original colonies, and I encourage you to look at the map as I talk about this, is that most of the major cities, think Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, all of these principal cities were coastal cities. The American colonists, for the most part, looked east for their livelihood. They were mostly merchants, traders. The Atlantic Ocean was their lifeline. Almost every American colonial city and American colonist lived within a 2-day journey from the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Because why would you go west if all the jobs were located along the coast? Well, some people did go west, and they were the poor people. Poor people who couldn't afford to buy land on the coast, so they went west. And when they went west, they bumped into Native American tribes who wanted nothing to do with the white English colonists, the Americans, pressing westward, and they were likely to fight you. But as more and more American colonists were born and there was more of a need for land, these original pioneers started going westward to become farmers and to fight Native Americans to take their land so that they would have an opportunity to survive. So slowly the western border, which is very hard to define, begins moving westward throughout the 18th century. The last thing I want to say about the original colonies is this. All of the original colonies had different cultures that were largely geographic in nature. Let me take a moment to explain this. Some colonies were established by Puritans. Puritans were religious radicals. They called themselves pilgrims. You might think of Thanksgiving, or the first Thanksgiving, when you think of the Puritans or the Pilgrims. In the early 17th century, in 1620, they were fleeing from the King of England back then because, like I said, 17th century in England, there were cruel and oppressive kings. And this radical religious group, which believed mostly in equality, they wanted some place to escape to. So they came to North America. And they settled largely in Massachusetts, the Boston Bay area, and then they spread down to Connecticut. And so in the colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts, there was both staunch religiosity and a sense of, hey, everybody's equal here and we don't like having a king. Now, contrast that with the colony of New York. Colony of New York actually wasn't originally an English colony. It was originally a Dutch colony established by Dutch merchants. They had their city, New Amsterdam. And then the Dutch decided they didn't want New Amsterdam anymore, so they sold New Amsterdam to the English, and the English renamed New Amsterdam New York City. And it was a city of merchants, of traders. Seems appropriate. And then there were the colonies that the King of England said, I want that area. I am going to hire people to go and settle that area for me. So for example, in the 17th century, King Charles II selected an area that would become South Carolina. And the city of Charleston is named after King Charles II. King George I said, I want this other area south of South Carolina. Bet you can guess what it's called. Georgia, named after George I. The original American colony, Virginia. Virginia was settled in the name of not a king, but rather a queen. Her name was Queen Elizabeth I, and people called her the Virgin Queen because she refused to marry. And so Virginia was named after Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. So these colonies, which you'll notice are all established in the South, they were established by royal charter. So you have a very different culture in those southern colonies. A culture where some of that old aristocratic hierarchy was established. So you'd have the landowners with large plantations and the people who worked for those large landowners. It's, of course, also the part of the American colonies where slavery would really be established, the southern colonies. So to review, each of the original 13 American colonies is governed by a king, the King of England, who appoints a governor to live in the colony, at the capital of the colony, to enact the king's law there in the colony, to enact which would be English law. But for the most part, the people in the American colonies were largely free to do as they please. After all, it was a long way away from England, the mother country. Each colony was its own political entity. They were able to make their own laws and create their own money that was completely independent from the other colonies. There was really no unity between the colonies, except that they all had governors that reported to the same king. The colonies were founded for different reasons. Some colonies largely established by merchants, traders, trying to make money, like New York. Other colonies were established by religious radicals wanting their own religious freedom, like Connecticut and Massachusetts. And others were established directly by an English monarch to expand the British Empire. So think Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia. In the middle of the 18th century, it would have been an utterly bizarre thing for the American colonists to think to themselves, hey, we should all unite. Let's create a common government and let's split off from England and do our own thing as United States. That would have been bizarre and probably downright preposterous. After all, Georgia and New York, they're doing their own thing. Massachusetts and Virginia, they've got a completely different culture. So how did it happen? How did the process begin that these colonies started to think, well, maybe we should all get together? Well, like most big changes in history, it happened because of a war. Specifically, what we Americans call the French and Indian War. Now, if you remember, most of the jobs and the money in the American colonies, they're located along the coast. The American colonists are very eastward facing. The only people who are going west are the poor people. And unless you're poor and desperate, there is not a lot of reason to try to venture out west and try to clear land and farm land and fight Native Americans who don't want you there. If you could, you'd stay east in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. But more and more Americans are being born, more and more Americans are spreading westward. These are the original pioneers. And by the time we arrive to the middle of the 18th century, 1754, it's not just Native Americans that the pioneers are having to deal with. There's another European empire that's out there, France. The French had claimed huge territories in North America, which would include modern-day Canada, and here, in the current United States, everything in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. This would include modern Ohio. Now, the French were settling North America in a different way than the English. They're going into the interior, which means they are making money through trading with Native American tribes. Their settlements aren't really whole colonies like the English or American colonies, but rather they're cities. So the French established cities like Detroit, St. Louis, Louisville. These are cities that are all located along waterways where traders and trappers can live and then venture out into the woods, interact with Native Americans, do their trading, do their trapping, report back to the city, and sell their goods. By the year 1720, the French have established probably the single most important city in North America, New Orleans. New Orleans is located near the mouth of the Mississippi River on the Gulf of Mexico. Whoever controls the city of New Orleans controls all of the trade coming out of North America, out of the interior of North America, anything west of the Appalachian Mountains. So what happens? You've got the French claiming the interior of North America. You've got the British claiming the coastline, but a lot of those American colonists who are British or English citizens, they're venturing farther and farther west. Eventually, there's going to be a conflict between the French and the English. And that conflict happened somewhere near the western frontier of Pennsylvania. If you take a moment to look at this map and you look at the squiggly line that represents the western edge of Pennsylvania, And that squiggly line should sort of approximate the Appalachian Mountain Range there in western Pennsylvania. There was a French diplomatic party that was coming in peace to discuss some of these border issues. But this French diplomatic mission was ambushed, not by Native Americans, but by a Virginia militia that was led by a 21-year-old young man named George Washington. Washington didn't see the French as a peaceful diplomatic envoy. The young man saw them as a threat. So, the American colonists opened fire upon the upon the French, and the two empires, the British and the French, went to war. Here in North America, here in the United States, we call this the French and Indian War. It lasted from 1754 to 1763. This was part of a much larger war that was a world war in which the French and the English were fighting over contested territories around the world, including in India as well. The whole world war is known as the 7 Years' War, and it didn't really get started until the year 1756. But the French and Indian War, which happened here in North America, is part of this much larger international conflict. It was called the French and Indian War because the Native American tribes, the Indians, they essentially had to choose sides. On whose side did you want to be on? Did you want to fight for the English, or did you want to fight for the French, or did you want to somehow try to stay out of it? And the various governments, the French and the English, tried to cajole the Native American tribes by making them promises. So the English, for example, said that, hey, if you help us and you fight for us and you get rid of the French presence in North America, here's what we'll do for you. We'll sign a treaty with all the tribes that says that we won't take any land in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So that's all yours, which sounds like a pretty sweet deal. On the other side, the French said, hey, the English say they're not going to spread westward, but you've heard that before. You know that they are going to spread westward, and we French have treated the tribes much more kindly by simply trading with you and continuing to allow you to live wherever it is you want to live. And so various tribes chose the French and other tribes chose the English. But the English are going to win, which is why we remember this today as the French and Indian War. And how did the English win this war? Well, one of the ways that they won this war is they invested a lot of money into the war. They outspent the French in terms of men and material, and England wins. So the American colonies remain English, not French. But the result is that the English treasury is completely out of money. So now you might be able to guess exactly what happens. Imagine you're the British government. Imagine your parliament. Your treasury is near empty. Now you need money. How are you going to rebuild the English treasury? Well, you've just fought a major war protecting the American colonists from becoming French. Those American colonies are also very lucrative. There is money in New York City. There is money in Boston. There is money in Philadelphia. If there's money in those American colonies and you need money, well, what are you going to do? So, you probably guessed it. The British government is going to begin taxing the American people. They're going to begin taxing the American colonists. So this begins in the middle of the 1760s. First, the British tax any paper goods that are being sold in the American colonies. This was the Stamp Act. They also place a particular tax on tea. They also place a tax on shipping and commerce. What was the result of all this in the American colonies? Well, the price of most goods starts to go up on just about everything, except for British tea. The price of British tea actually stayed down, but it forced the American colonists to buy the specific tea, giving the British revenue, and that's when some Americans decided to just start drinking coffee instead as a way of protest. The Americans were outraged by this, because the American colonists said, wait a minute, who has the right to levy taxes? We're British citizens. We're English. The only people who have the right to tax us are us, our representatives. That's what's in the English Bill of Rights. So the Americans began protesting, particularly in the city of Boston, no taxation without representation. We are English citizens. We are subject to English law. English law says you are not allowed to tax us unless we tell you that you're allowed to tax us. So that's the American perspective. What's the British perspective on all this? The British are like, wait a minute, we just saved your hides from becoming French. We saved you. Now, because we saved you, you're gonna have to pay. So pay your taxes. You wanna be part of this empire? You wanna be part of the biggest, most powerful empire on the face of the earth? You're gonna have to now pay your due, American colonists. So pay up. But the Americans are like, no, you're violating our rights as Englishmen. You're treating us as inferiors. We want no taxation without representation. And so the scuffles begin. In the year 1770, British troops had been placed in the city of Boston. Some rowdy Bostonians at night were provoking the British soldiers. It was December the 16th. It was cold. It was snowy. Snowballs and rocks were being thrown at the British soldiers. One of the guns goes off. The crowd was fired upon. A handful of Bostonians fell down dead. And it seemed like the British soldiers had cruelly just opened fire into a crowd. Now, that's not what happened. They were placed on trial in Boston. The British were represented by a young Boston lawyer by the name of John Adams, who was able to provide substantial evidence that the soldiers were in fact provoked by the crowd, and that the captain had done everything to make sure that the British soldiers stopped firing. And even though John Adams won the case in defense of the British soldiers, it didn't stop other Bostonians, men like Paul Revere, from propagandizing this particular event and convincing most of the people of Boston that the British soldiers were cruel. But the taxes didn't stop. The soldiers didn't stop coming over. John Adams' cousin, Sam Adams, formed a revolutionary group called the Sons of Liberty, who wanted to fight the British soldiers, drive them out, declare independence. After the Tea Act went into effect, these Sons of Liberty went dressed up as Native Americans, went onto a British ship, took out the tea that they were going to sell, and that money and the profits from that were going to go back to England, and they threw all the tea overboard into Boston Harbor. And then the war began. On April the 19th, 1775, the British were going after one of the wealthiest men in the American colonies, a man by the name of John Hancock, who had fled Boston into the Massachusetts countryside. And the British found out that the people of Massachusetts were stockpiling weapons in the countryside. And the British marched from Boston into Massachusetts, where they were stopped in the small town of Lexington, in the town park of Lexington Green, by a line of colonial patriots. And the British soldiers faced off against a line of American colonists, both looking at each other, both refusing to yield to the other. Who fired the first shot at the other? We don't know. It's been remembered as the shot heard round the world, but it was the Americans that suffered the defeat there, and the British pressed on to the city of Concord, Massachusetts. The American patriot Paul Revere had ridden ahead of the British, warning everybody that the soldiers were coming. Common farmers took to their hunting guns, and only after a great deal of bloodshed were the British turned around at Concord and came back to Boston. John Hancock never captured. And this, April 19th, 1775, is the beginning of the American Revolution. And it's this that leads to the American colonist, a year later, declaring that it is going to separate from the British Empire to become its own country. The American colonies had to come together for the first time during the French and Indian War, and there was actually the very first Continental Congress that happened during the French and Indian War. A man by the name of Benjamin Franklin designed a flag for the event. The flag said, "Unite or die." A lot of people think this flag is a Revolutionary War flag today, but it's not. It was actually a flag from the French and Indian War. The idea that the colonies needed to unite, to come together, to support each other, to stop the French from taking us over. And that had worked, that had helped. The American colonists and their English government won the French and Indian War. And it established a precedent for representatives from each of the 13 colonies meeting in the town of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to discuss their common interests. Why Philadelphia? Easy. Philadelphia is in the middle. Now, why did it take a year between 1775, April of 1775, and July of 1776 to declare independence? Well, largely because there was a lot of disagreement about whether or not we could work out our differences with the British. And it seemed like a lot of the problems were happening around Boston. So like South Carolina, for example, thought, well, does this Boston problem really represent a problem in South Carolina? If Massachusetts wants to break off and go free, it's fine, but maybe we don't want to. So there was a lot of discussion. There was a particular representative from Pennsylvania who really wanted to make peace with the king. He was a Quaker. He didn't like war. But when this Colonial Congress of Representatives, this Continental Congress, sent a letter to the King of England, George III, petitioning him to honor the American colonists of having the same rights and privileges of all the people in England, and the king refused, then that helped bring all of the colonists together. And all of the colonists, all the representatives from all of the colonies really started to feel that we are all Massachusetts. So, a vote was held for independence on July the 2nd, 1776. And all of the colonies voted for independence except for the colony of New York, which abstained from the vote. Filled with excitement was one of the representatives from Massachusetts, John Adams. John Adams recorded that he felt that in the future of American history, July the 2nd would be remembered with celebrations, with church bells ringing, and he specifically mentions fireworks. But of course, we don't remember July the 2nd as our day of independence, the day the vote was taken. We remember July the 4th. Why July the 4th? Well, because we don't remember the vote, we remember the document, the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July the 4th of 1776. When the Continental Congress was getting close to deciding upon independence in June of 1776, they selected 5 representatives in Congress to begin the process of writing a Declaration of Independence. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were among these 5 men. John Adams was a lawyer. He could certainly write legal treatises, but when it came to write a first draft, John Adams said, "I'm not the best writer in this group. The best writer of this group is an individual who's written several political essays, which are beautifully and eloquently written." And that was one of the representatives from Virginia, who was also part of this 5-man delegation. And his name was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was from the colony of Virginia. He was the owner of the large plantation Monticello. His family owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson was also a student of the Enlightenment. He had one of the largest personal libraries in North America. He was part of the Republic of Letters. He was fluent in multiple languages, including French, and he was constantly writing and receiving letters and discussing ideas. As a large plantation owner, he was interested in science and agricultural developments. He was interested in political philosophy and had written an essay on the government of Virginia. He was interested in architecture and had designed his own home on Monticello. And as interested as he was in the European culture of the Enlightenment and the exchange of ideas with Europe, he also was fascinated with the American West, the plants, the animals, the geography, the Native American tribes that were out there. He also wanted to learn more about that as well. Thomas Jefferson, at the Second Continental Congress, was a young man in his early 30s. He was tall, he was shy, but he was very articulate. He was a strong writer. John Adams knew this, and that's why John Adams tapped Thomas Jefferson to write the original draft for the Declaration of Independence. We tend to credit Thomas Jefferson for writing the Declaration of Independence, but in truth, it was a process. It was a committee process. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft and submitted this first draft to the 5 men, which would be the other 4, to review it. They made their editorial changes, and then they submitted it to the entire Congress. And the entire Congress looked over it for 2 days. And these editorial changes were emotionally difficult for Thomas Jefferson. I mean, how would you feel if you wrote this long essay and then it had to be subjected to, a whole committee, reviewing it and arguing it and talking about the language that you chose to use? And Thomas Jefferson was distraught through the whole process, but luckily for him, he had Benjamin Franklin there. And Ben Franklin has had a great wit and a great sense of humor and consoled Jefferson throughout the whole process. It's always good to have a friend who's a comedian to help you get through tough times. But even through all the editorial changes, the spirit of Thomas Jefferson's original draft remained largely intact. So, what is the Declaration of Independence? In the Declaration of Independence, we have 2 things. 1, we declare that we're separating from Britain. 2, we have a declaration of our principles. Let's take a look at what Thomas Jefferson wrote. He opens the Declaration of Independence simply saying, we are declaring our independence. But as I read this, I would like for you to pay attention to elements of the Enlightenment that are in this document. Let's take a look at it. Thomas Jefferson wrote, when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So in these opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, we have the first few lines, which are famous simply because they're the first lines. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. But then it's interesting what he says. We're not just splitting off. The last few words here, he's saying we need to explain why it's important that we're splitting off. We're going to give you a reason. So we're not just saying, hey, we're doing it, we're going to fight you and might makes right. But rather, he says, Thomas Jefferson says, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, our reasons are important, not just our ability to do so. So then he writes this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, a lot is said here. But hopefully as I'm reading this, you're thinking, this sounds kind of familiar. Something very similar was said almost 100 years before in 1690. The opening statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Wow, that certainly sounds a whole lot like what John Locke wrote in his 2 treatises on government. That all human beings are equal, that all human beings have rights, and John Locke said that our natural rights that we're born with are the rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, interesting that Jefferson doesn't stick with property, but he says the pursuit of happiness. Why did Thomas Jefferson make that change? Well, I need to be honest here as your teacher. There are a lot of arguments about why Thomas Jefferson made this change. I am not personally familiar with all of the arguments, but I do know this. By proclaiming that all people have the right to property, you're going to run into some problems if you actually believe that and advocate that. Does that mean as soon as you're an adult at age 18 that you have the right to property? If so, what's that property and where does it come from? Does that mean you turn 18 and you get the right to vote and your own apartment that's given to you by the government? Do you get your own parcel of land? Like, what's that mean? Pursuit of happiness is a lot more accommodating. Instead of just saying, okay, you have the right to protect your life, you have the right to do whatever it is you want to do, provided you don't hurt anybody else, and you have the right to try to make yourself happy in whatever way possible, including trying to buy your own home, have your own property. That's a lot easier than saying you have the right to property. So it's a small little change that Thomas Jefferson makes there. All right, but essentially, Thomas Jefferson is pretty much taking a lot of words from John Locke here. Now, you're hopefully already very familiar with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But look at the second part of this. Jefferson goes on to explain the reason and the purpose for government. And this too, he's taking almost directly from John Locke. No, let me rephrase that. He is taking this directly from John Locke. Let's read it again. Jefferson writes that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. Let me just stop there. Another way of saying this is, the role of the government isn't to tell the people what to do. The role of the government is to listen to the people and to protect their rights and to do what's best for the people, for what the people say is right based upon the people's representatives in government. All right, and then Thomas Jefferson goes on to write that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, in other words, when government gets mean and cruel, then it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. And the job of this government is to promote the safety and happiness of the people. So largely the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson's original draft draw significantly from the ideas of John Locke, and he published those ideas in the year 1690. All right, and after this eloquent opening to the Declaration of Independence, we get into the thick of the Declaration of Independence. If you've actually seen the Declaration of Independence, the text in its entirety, it's a fairly long document, even though we're really only most familiar with the beginning and the end of it. The thick of the document, is what we call a list of grievances against the King of England. This would be King George III. It is interesting that they don't blame Parliament. Parliament's the one that's actually ruling, but the Declaration of Independence lays the blame on the King of England. So here it goes. Thomas Jefferson writes, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." All right. So once again in the Declaration of Independence, we're not just going to say, hey, we're breaking off and going free. We want to explain to you why it's rational, why it's reasonable that we are going to break off and go free. Now, I am not going to show you the whole list of grievances that the Continental Congress presented to the King of England and Parliament. But I am going to focus on two. And I've chosen these two because one of them relates directly to the stuff that we've been talking about so far. And the second, which is famous because it was deleted from Thomas Jefferson's original text, and it relates significantly to the entirety of American history. Okay, so the first fact that was submitted to a candid world was this, and this was not the first in the whole list, but it's the one I'm talking about. They blamed the King of England for imposing taxes on us without our consent. So in other words, the King of England violated the English Bill of Rights. The British government's economic intrusion into American commerce was a major impetus for starting the whole rupture and friction between the American colonies and the government in England. And therefore, this is stated in the Declaration of Independence. And it also reflects this Enlightenment idea of John Locke that the job of government is to reflect the wishes of the people and to protect the rights of the people and not to bully the people. And this is just one of many abuses of the British government. Okay, and then the other grievance, which was deleted from the Declaration of Independence, is this one. This was a very interesting thing for Thomas Jefferson to write, and there's been a lot of discussion among historians about it. Here's what he wrote in the list of grievances in the original draft. He, the King of Britain, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transport thither. It's hopefully clear that Thomas Jefferson is blaming the King of England for starting slavery in the American colonies. Now, this is in no way true. The King of England, the slave trade had begun long before the birth of King George III. He didn't start it. He also didn't do much to stop it. But it's interesting that Thomas Jefferson puts this in the Declaration of Independence. Eliminating slavery would seem to be consistent with the spirit of equality, of rights, and the liberty of all humankind that the Declaration of Independence espouses, but it seems bizarre to blame the King of England for this. It's also bizarre because Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder himself. And this is part of the enigma of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a tough guy to figure out because he believes in the equality of humankind, but at the same time, he's a slave owner. And this is a tough thing to reconcile, and I'm not even going to begin to try to do that here. It shouldn't be too hard for you to imagine why this was deleted from the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You have representatives from several states that are slaveholding states, not just Virginia, but the Carolinas, Georgia. They believe in slavery. They want slavery. They are profiting from slavery. They do not like Thomas Jefferson's egalitarian idealism. They don't like that. They want this out of the Declaration of Independence, and they're not going to sign the Declaration of Independence with this in it. So this was struck from the Declaration of Independence. I bring it up because slavery and the aftermath of slavery is such an important part of the American story. And even here, in the deletion of this paragraph from the Declaration of Independence, we see the controversy around it. And we have, even back in the year 1776, a man who owned slaves seeing the injustice and articulating the injustice in slavery. All right, so there's that. After the long list of grievances, we get to the concluding words of the Declaration of Independence, in which we declare ourselves to be the United States of America and how we are willing to fight for our independence as the United States of America. And Jefferson writes, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Powerful words to finish off the Declaration of Independence. And I do often reflect upon this very, very last sentence of the Declaration of Independence, that the people who were the original people to deliver our freedom to us, to make us free, they were willing to stake on this gamble of fighting for independence because the British were powerful. And these individuals were willing to sacrifice their lives, their livelihood, all their possessions, and their dignity. And I think about this because I wonder, would I be willing to sacrifice my life, my possessions, and my dignity, what people think about me? Would I be willing to sacrifice these things in the quest and the fight for freedom? It's always a great thing to think about every 4th of July. But hey, the story is good. We did it. The Americans won. It was a long fight, 1775 to 1781. It was a costly war. Approximately 35,000 Americans died in the conflict or as a result of the conflict. And if we're honest, we probably couldn't have done it on our own. We did get a lot of help from the French. Why were the French willing to help us? Well, they wanted vengeance for the French and Indian War and having lost. They helped us out simply to put the British in their place. Hey, thanks, France. Wonder if we'll ever be able to pay you back someday. But we did it. And because we did it, the Declaration of Independence lives on. It is important to know that the Declaration of Independence is a statement of principles. It's important to know what it is not. It is not a legal document. It is arguably the foundation for all of our laws, but it is itself not a legal document. But it helps us to understand and to define what it means to be an American. You are an American. You have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You always have the right to defend yourself, to carry on living the best you are able. You have liberty. You have a right to largely do whatever it is that you would like to do, provided you do not hurt others. And although you are not simply handed property when you become an adult, you do have the right to pursue happiness, however it is that you would like to pursue it, either in your personal life or your professional life. We are a free people, largely a free people. There are certainly obstacles that prevent us from achieving life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Certainly, no society is completely fair, but at least our society is dedicated to the universal rights of all people. And one of the reasons that I so enjoy telling the story of American history is that we see over the course of nearly 250 years, more and more people being able to achieve living a life where they are free and they can pursue happiness as they define it. It is a wonderful thing that Thomas Jefferson included this for the foundational values of our country. Thomas Jefferson was a student of the Enlightenment. He believed that things could get better. He believed in questioning the institutions of the past, questioning authority, questioning tradition, to create a new society that would be better than the one before. And of all the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson was one of the most radical who really believed in the continual evolution of humankind and that things would continually get more free and happier as time went on. And today, you are the inheritors of these words. You as an individual are the inheritor of these words. As you think about the life before you, you know that you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, hey, thanks Thomas Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress of 1776. All right, so just a little bit more here. Hey, we won our independence. Hooray, hooray. Now we're a country. Okay, now what do we do? Well, we're going to need a government. What type of government are we going to have? Well, the one thing we don't want is we don't want to redo the British government. So our new government is going to be the exact opposite of the British government. Now, when I say the British government, I mean a government with a king and a very, very strong parliament that bullies its citizens. So when the United States of America creates its first government, it does so under a document that we called the Articles of Confederation. Our Congress got done writing the Articles of Confederation in 1777, but it wasn't enacted until after the Revolutionary War was over in 1781. And I don't have a lot to say about the Articles of Confederation for this particular lecture, except for this. So we were trying to be the opposite of Britain. What this meant was we're going to create a very weak central or federal government. But we are going to have very strong state governments. That way the people's representative, their local authorities, are going to have a lot more power than the central government. And our capital was New York City at this point in time. So an example of this, think of each state as its own country. So each state has its own laws. each state has its own currency. The state has the power to tax its people. Oppositely, the federal government, so the government of the United States of America, it does not have the power to tax its own people. It does have the power to create an army. So we will have an army of the United States of America, but this federal government essentially has to ask the state for, simply make a request for funds to fund that military. There is no central currency. There's no common American currency yet. The federal government can pass laws, but get this, the government is made up of representatives, 2 representatives from each state, and in order for a law to pass, it has to be a unanimous passage from each state. So it's very difficult to pass legislation. So the individuals who drafted the Articles of Confederation, if their goal was to make the United States of America the exact opposite of Britain, they were highly successful. There is no strong central government in the United States of America. Essentially, each state was its own government. So that's good, right? The people rule. Hooray, hooray. We can do our own thing. And New York can do its thing, and Massachusetts can do its thing, and Georgia can do its thing. If we're ever attacked again, if we all go to war again, like we did in French and Indian War or the American Revolution, then we will come together. We've got a common army. Now, how we pay for that army is a different matter entirely, but hey, maybe that's good. Maybe we won't finance an army unless it's absolutely necessary. So it seems good, but it led to a lot of problems. For example, let's talk about New York City. Now, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the 1780s or the early 21st century. New York City is a very important city for traders, for merchants, for business people who want to make money. There's a lot coming and going in and out of New York City. Same's true today as it was in the 1780s. So look at this map. See where New York City is geographically located. I put a big white star on this map. You'll notice that New York City is located right there at the bottom tip of New York, but you can see New Jersey and Connecticut from it. Connecticut and New Jersey are pretty stinking close to New York City, especially New Jersey. It's right across the Hudson River. So business people in New Jersey and Connecticut were shipping a lot of their goods through New York City. So in other words, to just use a simple example, there might be a businessman in New Jersey who's having sugar cane shipped in from the Caribbean that's going to go up into New York City. It's going to dock in New York City. He's going to take his sugar and he's going to bring it into New Jersey and sell it. Well, New York, realizing this, passes a law. This is the New York legislature. They pass a law that puts a stiff tax on any goods that go into New Jersey and Connecticut. So New York starts making money, and individuals in Connecticut, New Jersey feel like they're getting ripped off because they don't have a better place to ship their goods in and out of. So if you were one of these merchants in New Jersey or Connecticut, what would you do? Would you just say, oh, okay, I guess we got to pay a stiff fine or a stiff tax because we've got to ship out of New York City? Or would you fight it? Well, of course they tried to fight it. So what did they do? They put pressure on the legislatures of New Jersey and Connecticut to, get this, declare war on New York. Now this war doesn't happen, taxes get reduced, but New Jersey and Connecticut almost went to war with New York. This is not a sign of a strong, new, young country. And by the way, the British loved hearing stories about this. Oh, look, the states are getting ready to go to war with themselves. And the British are actually just waiting for their opportunity to take over once again. And they will try again. That'll be called the War of 1812, where the British try to take back their former American colonies. All right, so the situation in New York City is an example of how the Articles of Confederation maybe aren't working out too well. But things really come to a head in the year 1886 and 1887 in rural Massachusetts. And this situation involves Revolutionary War veterans and taxes. When the United States of America won the American Revolution and we earned our independence, we still had an extraordinarily weak economy. Instead of getting paid with cash, a lot of war veterans were simply awarded territories. For example, lands in Ohio, which were formerly the possession of the Shawnee, were divided up and given to American war American Revolutionary War veterans as payment for their service. So you could come to Ohio and farm land and make money that way. Well, the situation in Massachusetts after the American Revolution was rather dire. The government of Massachusetts didn't have much money, so they needed money. What did they do? They began taxing their people. The people who controlled the legislature were mostly representing the wealthier class of Massachusetts citizens. The poor people of Massachusetts probably were not effectively represented in their state government. And tax collectors came around to collect taxes from poor people, and some of these poor people were American Revolutionary War veterans. So here were a group of people who had fought for the independence of the United States of America. They haven't themselves profited financially at all from it, and now it's no longer the English government that's overtaxing them, it's now the state government of Massachusetts. So one particular American war veteran named Daniel Shays in Massachusetts, a poor man and a hardened veteran, said, well, enough of this. I fought one government over taxes and no taxation without representation. I'm going to do it again. It wasn't too hard for him to find other Revolutionary War veterans who were willing to accompany him in this task. They went to Springfield, Massachusetts, where they took control of an armory, and we have a small civil war in Massachusetts. The story of Shays' Rebellion ends up being tragic for Daniel Shays and the Shaysite rebels. They lose. And these desperate rebels really felt and believed that they were fighting the government of Massachusetts for the same reason they were fighting the government of Great Britain. And it led to a crisis in the United States of America. The government under the Articles of Confederation wasn't working. The original government under the Articles of Confederation was highly successful in becoming the opposite of Great Britain. But after these particular crises, such as the example of Shays' Rebellion and Connecticut and New Jersey threatening to go to war with New York, there was a sense that the time had come to bring the American states together, to form a stronger United States of America, with a government that would last, where the rights of the people could be better protected, and perhaps we would have the opportunity to develop a stronger economy, and the states would be more cooperative in creating that stronger economy. So another convention was held. Once again, it was held in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The goal of this convention in 1787 was to review and to revise the Articles of Confederation. But it wasn't too long into this convention where all the members present decided that they were essentially going to throw out the Articles of Confederation and write a completely new Constitution for the United States of America. And that will be the subject of our next lecture. And that's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed learning a little something about the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Have a wonderful day.